For the last part of the semester, we are going to shift gears into talking about journalism and news. Now, when talking about journalism and news, we are going to back up a little bit and talk not so much about the history per se, but looking a little bit at the background of what journalism is. And the reason that we're doing that is because even though this is something that is covered in courses like mass media, courses like Introduction to Broadcasting, not everybody takes the same courses, and certainly not everybody takes the same courses in the same order, so not everybody will necessarily have covered that already. But journalism is important to understand the history of it, to really help us understand why it is the way that it is, why there's so many different ways to write, how come there's so many different forms of journalism, and just like a lot of other fields that relate to the media, journalism obviously being a big part of the media, it's in a very much a state of flux. Online journalism is completely changing the course of how we look at things. Different ways of communicating information are completely changing how we stay informed. And that's a really big part of it, is that when we talk about journalism, it can be a little bit tricky because a lot of what is taught, even now, even what I'm going to talk about, is the somewhat older way of doing things. But because it's in such a state of flux, a lot of this is kind of dependent on where you work. A lot of this is kind of dependent on your position. A lot of this is kind of dependent on what kinds of things you're covering, what your mode is, how you're going to present that information. So when we talk about journalism, know that this really is just kind of scratching the surface of it because it is such a deeply complicated field. And because, again, it's a field that is absolutely in a state of transition right now. And it really has been for the last 10, 15 years and probably will be for the next 20 years. What is journalism? Well, it's defined as the practice of investigating, reporting events, issues, and trends to mass audiences. Pretty straightforward. You're figuring out what's going on. You're gathering information. You're letting the public know what's happening in the world around them. And what is the basic role of journalism? Well, there's a couple of different ones. One is to, as we just said, provide information. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want to make sure that your public is able to make informed decisions. Now, I also want to just throw a disclaimer out. As I'm talking about this right now, I'm talking about this in a very optimistic way, because this is not always how journalism works. We know that journalism can be incredibly one-sided. We know that the media absolutely can have ulterior motives, especially depending on what media you're looking at or what, their goal is. So what we're talking about right now definitely is a somewhat optimistic version of what journalism is, but we have to understand the foundations of it before we can kind of start breaking into some of the problems in journalism. So the basic role of it, the basic reason journalism exists, is to inform the public so that we can make informed decisions. It's often referred to as the watchdog. Sometimes it is referred to as the government watchdog because one of the, fundamental roles of journalism is to keep an eye on the government, is to make sure the government is doing what they're supposed to be doing, making sure that they're not doing what they're not supposed to be doing, keeping an eye, making sure things are happening the way they're supposed to be happening. You also may have heard of journalism or the media in general being referred to as the fourth estate. What this is referring to is our government system has three estates. We have the legislative branch, which is Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, and the judicial branch, which is the court system. Those are the three estates. The idea of the fourth estate is technically an unofficial one. It is the role of the media to once again serve as a watchdog for these other branches, to make sure that things are happening the way they're supposed to be happening. Again, this is a very optimistic way of looking at it, though, isn't it? Because even as I'm talking about this, depending on when you're listening to this, you might be like, oh, this does not seem like this is what journalism and media actually is doing. It is, sometimes, but there's, again, so much out there, and it's in such a state of flux right now, it can be kind of complicated to really look at, okay, what's actually happening in the industry on the whole. So what is journalism on a ground level? What is it you're trying to do? Well, the basic role of journalism, the basic thing that you're supposed to do, is answer the 6 questions. Now, this is something you may remember from like 4th grade, it's the 6 fundamental questions when you're trying to learn about something, when you're trying to inform somebody of something that you have to ask. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. The who? Who's involved? What happened? Where did it happen? When did it happen? And then the last 2 are a bit more complicated. Why did it happen? And how? So let's say you are a journalist and you're simply reporting on something relatively straightforward like a car accident. The who would be who is involved in that car accident. Now, you may be able to give names, you may not be able to give names, but you'll be able to give some sort of description. A family of 4, a truck driver. What would be were involved in an accident? You may be able to give a little bit more details in terms of what kind of an accident it was, what were they driving, things of that nature. Where did it actually take place? It was at the corner of street and street. When did this happen? 5:30 in the morning on Tuesday. Again, the why and the how can be a little bit more complicated. The why can be something as simple as, if it's something like a car accident, the driver didn't yield, or it was icy conditions, or there was mechanical failure, something like that. And then the how, again, this one is the most complicated. How did this actually occur? Now, in this case of a car accident, the why and how very much blend together into kind of one big thing. Why did this occur? How did this thing occur? But depending on what you're talking about, these might be a little bit more clearly defined. But again, your job as a journalist is to answer these 6 fundamental questions. Not only do you want to answer those questions, you need to find out what kind of stories can you report. Now, I will admit, I did work in journalism for a while. I didn't work in journalism for super long. I was only at the newspaper I worked for about 3 years, something like that. And at the time, I was actually, it was basically a media company. And at the time, I was also working in their PR department. So that's predominantly what I did. But I did work within their journalism field. I was not great at journalism for a couple of reasons. One, I was too shy. I wasn't good at just going up and talking to people. That's definitely something you need to be good at when you're involved in journalism, and I was just too shy to do this. The other thing, I was not great when it came to this idea of newsworthiness. Thank God I had an editor who could point me in the right direction and would give me assignments, things to cover, because if I had to come up with my own stories to cover, especially if we're talking a small town, it could be really difficult to know what am I supposed to write a story on right now. The idea of newsworthiness, the 7 factors of newsworthiness, helps you figure out what's important. What kind of stories should you be covering? The 7 elements are impact, timeliness, prominence, proximity, conflict, and currency. Now, a story may not have all of these things. In fact, it probably doesn't. But if it has one of them, this is what makes it newsworthy. This is something you should be covering. Impact is exactly what it sounds like. There is some sort of an impact to this story. A local factory is closing. That has a lot of impact because a lot of people might lose their jobs. So there has to be a reason for it. It's not just a fluff piece. Now, fluff pieces exist, and that's okay. But that's different from news. News is, once again, here to inform you. So what is the impact of that story? What's the timeliness? If it's something that's happening right now, that becomes timely. If it's a press conference that's going on right now, it's timely. Even if it is a fluff piece, even if it's covering sports, even if it's covering the local parade, it's timely in that case. So the reason you're covering it is because it happened last night. What's interesting about this one of timeliness is this one obviously has a timeline to it. There are certain things that if you don't cover them on time, they don't really matter anymore. There's no interest in it if you don't cover it within a day or two of that event happening or that event coming up. Prominence is the idea that the person who is involved is somehow well-known, that it involves a well-known person or a well-known institution. This could be anything even like celebrity news. A person getting into a car accident will make news locally, but you're not going to hear about car accidents that happen 2 or 3 counties over unless it is somebody of prominence. If it turns out that it's a local celebrity or a business leader, you might hear about it, towns away. It might be in the news all across the state. In some cases, it's in the news across the entire country. If we're talking something like, plane crashes, there was a somewhat recent plane crash that happened in my area and it killed 3 people. That is something that's going to be impactful. It's going to have proximity because it happened in, near my community. It was news here, but you probably didn't hear about it in Rochester. You didn't hear about it in Syracuse, not really. Whereas if it's something like Kobe Bryant was killed in a helicopter accident, that became worldwide news because of the prominence. Proximity is physical location. So again, this is something that happens nearby. If it happens too far away, your audience doesn't really care about it. People don't care about, parades. People don't care about sporting events. People don't care about tax reforms and voting initiatives in places where they don't live, things that don't affect them. So it has to be nearby. Oddity is a fun one because oddity is the idea that sometimes stories get covered just because they're so darn weird. Weird stuff happens, people do ridiculous things, and suddenly that becomes news. Think about 90% of the stuff that's covered on BuzzFeed. A lot of what's going on there is the idea of oddity. A car being stolen, isn't news. In fact, a car being stolen probably isn't going to make news even in the town you're in. But if a car is stolen by a 12-year-old, that's unusual. That's going to make news, possibly nationally, because it's just such a weird thing that happened. Conflict is the idea that anytime there's a conflict between two people, there might be news. Now, this could be literally things like acts of violence. This could be political things, but this also could be just sports. Somehow there's a conflict involved. Currency is the idea that whatever is happening is playing into current events. So think of things involving social issues. Think of things that are happening that are, going back to that idea of timely. If there's something going on in the world around you and somehow this story can relate to that, that is the idea of currency. So this is often something you do see in more soft pieces where, maybe, right now, obviously, regardless of when you're listening to this, there is obviously a lot of political things going on. There's a lot of social issues going on. So a journalist might write a story about a person who was an important figure locally in the civil rights movement in the 60s. In that case, it's all about currency because what happened is related to current events. It's something that relates to what's going on in the world around us. Now, when it comes to journalism, there's a couple of different types that exist. So this is where we're getting into a little tiny bit of the history to really kind of help flesh out how journalism works the way it does and why journalism works the way it does. So we have objective journalism, interpretive journalism, advocacy journalism, and then we have editorials and opinion pieces, which are not technically defined as journalism at all, but they do exist within that realm, so it's still important to talk about them. So let's start with objective journalism. Now, objective journalism is really the model that most people believe should be what we strive to do as journalists because it's unbiased news. It is purely and truly objective, or at least it's supposed to be. So the idea behind this is that you are reporting just the facts. You're not putting any of your own opinion in it. You're not putting any of your own bias in it, just the facts. The big question that comes up with objective journalism, though, is it actually possible to be truly and purely objective? Is it possible to report something that doesn't have any opinion in it at all? Most people, myself included, say not really. Just because of human nature, there's going to be at least a little bit of a bias in it, whether it be what you choose to talk about, the order in which you present the information, your word choice, what interviews you put first and what interviews you put second in the story, how you talk about things. A little bit of your bias is most likely just going to naturally come through it. But the idea here is that you're taking opinion out and you're, once again, just giving the facts. And the way we do that is by following something called the inverted pyramid. Now, if you've taken any media classes in the past, you may have heard of this because this is a very standard kind of fundamental way of presenting information. And the inverted pyramid basically looks like this, that you put your most important information at the top of your story. So whether that is in the first, paragraph or two, if it's a written story, or whether it's in the first, 2 or 3 sentences of if it is a broadcast story, we call that our lead. We'll talk more about the actual breakdown and the formatting in the next unit. Then after you get through the basics, you go through the body, which is basically looking at what are the things that you need to add to it. What are all the background information? What's all that other stuff? And then the end of it, called the wrap-up or the tail, is basically when you're just kind of summarizing everything, adding any sort of extra information into it. So again, the inverted pyramid is the beginning of your story. You always put the most important stuff. Your who, what, where, when, why, and how. So you put the big stuff right there. Then you're going to kind of fill in the gaps after that. So why do we use the inverted pyramid? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that when the inverted pyramid was developed, it literally did have to do with technology that we're talking about, sending news over telegraph lines, when we had very kind of spotty communication. So when a journalist was able to call in a story or when things were being printed, you always wanted to put the most important information first. So that way, if you lost contact, you at least got the most important information there. Nowadays, there's a very different reason, and it has to do with human attention span. Now the average person only reads the first couple of articles, if that, of a news story. They don't read it all the way through. The percentage of people who actually continue reading an article when it continues to another page or when you have to click the read more if you're reading it online, it's ridiculously small. The average person only reads really the first 1 or 2 paragraphs, or in some cases, just the headline. So you have to make sure that you're putting all the pertinent information right there at the beginning. The problem with objective journalism, though, is that because it only gives the facts, sometimes it doesn't give enough of the story. Because sometimes there's too much background information. There's too much other stuff that really is necessary. There's too much context to the story that needs to be explained so that it actually makes sense. Objective journalism was kind of the main form of journalism all the way to the basically midpoint of World War I. Now, when we transition from one period of journalism into another, I want to be clear that the previous forms don't disappear. It's just that new forms develop and emerge that now work together. So basically what happened was at the halfway point of World War I, right before the Americans really got involved, it was confusing. Even now, if you ask the average person to tell you anything about World War I, there's not a whole lot people can tell you because the reason for the war was a bit convoluted for most people. It wasn't like World War II, where we had a much more clearly defined enemy. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We had Hitler to deal with. With World War I, basically what happened is we have the assassination, of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and all of a sudden the whole world is at war. That's all objective journalism ultimately would tell you. They would tell you the Archduke was assassinated. They would tell you the Lusitania was sunk by a submarine. But it wouldn't really give you anything else. What interpretive journalism did is it developed at this point to basically give the context and the background around those facts so that people understood why it mattered. Why does it matter that this person was assassinated? Because this country is now at war. This country is allies with this country. This country is allies with this country. Why does it matter that this ship sank? Because it involves this country who now has allegiances with this country. It explains everything so that people can understand why it happened. Interpretive journalism is very important because the world we live in is complicated. Situations are complicated, and sometimes just giving the facts oversimplifies things. You need somebody to explain to you and to give you the context why those facts are important, how those facts fit in together, and basically what does this story actually mean. Another form of journalism that we have is something called advocacy journalism. Advocacy journalism is one that openly advocates for a cause. This form of journalism really emerged in the 1960s, basically when the civil rights movement was happening, when we were involved in the war in Vietnam. And the reason advocacy journalism showed up was basically because there was a lot going on. And journalists, writers started to openly advocate for causes. When you think of a lot of news stations today, this is probably what they are. When you think of something like Fox News openly advocates for Republican and conservative causes. If you look at something like CNN pretty openly advocates for liberal and Democrat causes. If you were to look at something like the BBC out of England, that is much more of an interpretive or objective journalism. It's not openly advocating. If you look at something like NPR, that tends to be a little bit more neutral. Advocacy journalism is openly supportive. This can be a very good thing in the sense that it does give you, once again, a lot of information, but a lot of people do view this as being a bit, I don't know if the right word is unethical, but being a bit complicated, because if you are openly advocating for a cause, you might not be really providing the whole story. And that is ultimately what we're seeing in a lot of our media today, is that depending on what station you're watching, you're really only getting part of the story. That immediately leads me to editorials and opinion pieces. And these are so closely related to advocacy journalism that they've really kind of become combined together. And basically what this is exactly what it sounds like. It's the news stories, it's the television shows where it's not real facts. They're just talking about conjecture. They're just talking about speculation. So think of a lot of the shows on Fox News where it's just the different political personalities, the different commentators basically yelling at each other. The problem, once again, with this is that it confuses information for opinion. Editorials and opinion pieces absolutely have their place. But the issue is that a lot of times these editorials, these opinion pieces are presented as straight news. And because of that, people can get really confused what's real and what's not. Again, this is something we used to have to talk about a lot more even just 15 years ago. But the world that we live in today, you guys are probably all very, very aware of this. But it's important to keep it in the back of your mind. How do these different forms of journalism function? How do I want to write? What kind of journalist, what kind of writer do I want to be? When working in journalism, there's a couple of different things you want to try to be careful of, be aware of. You want to watch out for yellow journalism. You want to watch out for something called herd journalism, for something called infotainment. And then the last two are basic kind of wrap-ups of what we talked about already. Misinformation and bias. Yellow journalism is another term you've probably studied extensively in other classes, so we're just going to do a very quick summary here. Yellow journalism is the kind of stuff you see in the Inquirer. It's very sensationalized. It's stories that are highly exaggerated. In a lot of cases, it is straight up made up. Now, just a little bit of history, how yellow journalism ultimately developed was in New York City in the newspaper wars. We had two different newspapers who were basically fighting for readership, and they realized that if they started to have, bigger and more interesting stories, they would get more readers, and this slowly turned into making things up. This slowly turned into exaggerating. Again, because this is not a full history class, we're not going to go into much more than that, but yellow journalism has really ultimately turned into just lying about stuff. The problem, once again, with this is that it's entertaining, and in some cases, it can be, I guess you can almost say harmless, when it's obviously fake, when it's obviously not real, when it's obviously just there for entertainment. But the problem is it so often presents itself as being legitimate news. So if we look at something like the National Enquirer, so the image that's on the screen right here is about Meghan Markle. This was just a random one that I chose. I don't even know if there's a date on this. I don't see one. Oh, wait, on the bottom. This one's from September 2009. So it is interesting if we look at the royals in this case, because the royals are ones who have very much spoken out against this, that the paparazzi hounds them, that, obviously their lives are made pretty horrible because of the way the media talks about them. And yes, you can make a whole discussion, well, you're the royals. What did you think was going to happen? That's not what we're talking about right now. That's obviously a side effect of this. But when we see stories in the Inquirer, when we see stories in newspapers like this, we generally know that it's yellow journalism. We generally recognize that it's not real, that it is exaggerated, that it's just there to sell newspapers. But the real problem is when yellow journalism seeps into more of our traditional news. Once again, very similar problems to what we have with our editorials, with our opinion pieces, with advocacy in some cases, is that it can be exaggerated, it can be sensationalized to the point that people don't really know what's real and what's not. Another really interesting and a very arguably unethical form of journalism that I want to mention is something called herd journalism. Herd journalism is often referred to as ambulance chasing journalism. So on one hand, it's important to get to the story. On one hand, you want to try to get there and you want to give all the information, but at the other, side of things, what often will happen is that journalists, photographers will be sent to scenes of tragedies to try to get the saddest shot first, to try to get the most tragic image they can. Now, granted, sometimes this can be really important. This can be, images, especially if we're talking about images of war, images of, poverty, images of famine, where stuff like that is important. We need to see it so that we realize this is a reality. But a lot of people have pointed their fingers at, herd journalism that does things like body bag shots or stalking grieving family members to try to get the first shot, of them crying or the first shot after somebody's death. And once again, that can be really ethically problematic. So even some of these images right here, just to tell you what's going on. So this is an actual shot that ran in the news. This is the body bag of Heath Ledger. There actually was another photo when he first passed away a number of years ago that was on Yahoo. That was through his window as they were zipping the body bag up. That one got taken down very quickly and I've never found it again. So that one would be a pretty extreme example of ambulance chasing or herd journalism. The main question that you can ask with stuff like this is there any new information being revealed here? Because if we're photographing scenes of war, you can argue that photographing horrifying things, reporting on horrifying things, is really important because it's shining the light on a really real, an important issue. For something like this, what's the issue here? What's the reason for this image? Now, again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is very much a discussion that's been happening in the journalism field. Or here's another one. This was actually the scene outside of the apartment of Philip Seymour Hoffman after it had been, the story broke that he had passed away. This is only half the crowd. But can you imagine if you're a grieving family member and this is what you see? Or another one, this one right here. This one needs a little bit of background information. This is the mother of Terri Schiavo. So Terri Schiavo was a case from a number of years ago where she was in a car accident and was declared brain dead, and it became a legal battle between her husband and her parents about who had the legal right to make medical decisions for her. The husband wanted to unplug her machines and let her pass away, and her parents wanted to hold on a little bit longer with the hopes that she would eventually wake up because there were certain signals there. This was a really controversial case and became a really important court case. But what ended up happening is after the parents lost the suit and they unplugged her, they knew it was going to take, potentially a couple of days for her to pass away. So what happened was newscasters camped out basically in the road in front of the Schiavo's houses, in front of the hospital, all trying to get the first tragic image. That is a classic example of herd journalism. To lighten things up a little bit, we also have the issue of something called infotainment. Infotainment is basically the combining of information and entertainment together. So there's a couple of ways that we'll see this. You'll have shows that are meant to be entertaining but actually provide information, and then there's shows that are meant to be information that focus so much on ratings and try to become entertaining that it blends the line between the two. There's positive and negatives to both of these. The positive to infotainment. So if we look at something like John Oliver would be considered infotainment, Seth Meyers, back in the day, The Daily Show, obviously still The Daily Show, but The Daily Show was really a good example of this a couple of years ago. Even if we look at things like Fox News, MSNBC, stuff like that is often considered infotainment because its focus is very much on ratings, not so much on the news as it is about just getting people to watch. The negative of this is that often you're focusing so much on getting ratings, getting people to watch you, and being entertaining that you lose the news. You start to lose your credibility. Even as a for instance, when I listen to radio news, I actually listen to radio news out of Canada because I like it better. I think it's a little bit more objective and straightforward. And one time I was listening when my sister was in the car, and she actually made a comment that it was weird listening to Canadian news because there was no music in the background. It was just them giving the local news. And that it was interesting to me because I had never really noticed it before because I was so used to listening to Canadian news, for local news, I didn't even notice. Whereas then if you do listen to the local radio stations, 102.5, 98.5, they almost always have music in the background. That is technically a form of infotainment. The positive, though, is that if we're talking, again, something like John Oliver, statistics are showing people under the age of 35 get a majority of their news from these kind of shows. They're not watching mainstream news anymore. So if you're able to inform people, even if it's in an entertaining way, there's going to be some positives in that as well. There's definitely a lot of things to consider ethically. This is a very short unit because a lot of this is just going to be a matter of practice. I'm also going to link a bunch of YouTube videos for you looking at different online newscasters because YouTube news is very much growing in popularity, whether it's something like the Young Turks or whether it's something like Philip DeFranco has become a pretty prominent news source online where he basically just does daily updates about what's going on in the world around us. He very much would be considered an interpretive journalist because he tells you what's going on, but then gives you all of the background information and explains why it's so important. So the kind of tone of news absolutely is shifting. But again, I'll drop a bunch of links into Blackboard for you, things to look at. But some other things to think about is one of the big questions in modern news is the balancing act between speed and accuracy. Because let's say you get to an event. You get to something that happened. You want to get that story out as soon as possible, especially if it's a tragedy, especially if it's something like, unfortunately, we've seen this exact situation happen with school shootings. You want to get that story out as quick as you possibly can. But the problem is sometimes in your rush of getting the story out, you don't have an opportunity to check your sources. So because of that, you may end up giving wrong information. This is something that actually did happen during the Virginia Tech shootings back in whatever year that was. I honestly don't recall off the top of my head. The news stations that were covering it were so quick to get the stories out that they gave a lot of wrong information. They gave a lot of wrong information about how many shooters they think it was, if it was still active, if it wasn't active, or if they had slowed down a little bit and really checked their sources, they would have been able to give a more accurate story, but they wouldn't have been as fast. So there really was a balancing act there. And then again, there's a huge consideration of news versus sensationalism. Straight hard news is a tough sell. Most people, especially in the younger generations, don't watch the news. I mean, I'm not that young, and I don't watch the evening news. I don't watch the evening news at all. Where I get my news is I do get it online from a variety of different sources. It doesn't necessarily mean it's better or worse getting it that way, but it is something to consider, is how people are getting their news is absolutely changing. In fact, I often hear people say things like journalism is dead, newspapers are dead. They absolutely are not. They're just existing in a different form than they did before. Again, because things are constantly changing, there's a couple of modern issues we also need to consider. Something like clickbait. We all know what clickbait is, right? Whenever you make that headline just to get people to click on it, but that headline is a bait and switch, the story's not what it's about, or there's nothing in the story. It's a very clickbaity headline. That's something to really watch out for because it gets you a lot of clicks, it gets you a lot of views, but it's also a quick way to damage your reputation. Listicles are another big one. Listicles are the sort of things you see on BuzzFeed, where they give you the information in list form, where it's basically like the 10 whatever, and then they list those things out. What I find interesting about listicles is that obviously they're not great because it does tend to simplify news, it tends to minimize it. But I will even say, if I click on an article and I go to read it and there isn't a form of like a listicle in it, I sometimes have a harder time reading through it. Where if they're talking about like these are the 5 most important things to know coming into the election, or the 5 most important things to know about, the new student loan laws, if it's written in a straight paragraph format, sometimes I have a harder time picking out what the important information is. And if it's something where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all the information filled out, it tends to be a little bit easier. And I'm saying that as somebody who is educated and actually does read the news. It just shows you how kind of used to this idea of listicles we've become. Non-news, recently coined fake news, also another thing to be aware of. I think in general, it's not even remotely as common as we hear, but it is something that does exist. There absolutely is information out there that's just straight up not true. And then another big thing to be aware of, fear-mongering. This is something that is talked about in a lot of other classes. Fear does sell. Fear does get people's attention. But it's another way to quickly ruin a reputation, and it's something just to be aware of. So even looking at things like the clickbait, just to look at a couple of different examples here. Something like TV and computer crazes giving kids cancer. That's definitely a clickbait sort of article. It's very sensationalized, trying to get you to pay attention. Or this one down here. You'll often get these kind of ads on the side of like social media. 31 stars you forgot were transgender. And you look at that picture and you're like, well, that's, depending on how old you are, that's either Minkus from Boy Meets World or it's Mouth from One Tree Hill. And that's the girl from, I forget what it was, that reality show of like joke videos. Those aren't the same person, but they'll often set things up in a way to try to get you to click on the article. Or here's a couple of other favorite clickbait articles of mine. Pat Sajak walked off the set after this Wheel of Fortune fail. Yeah, it's a joke, like not really. Where you're saying her voice was so amazing, then they turned around to see her, they were speechless. Once again, probably just a kid. It's the sort of things we see all of the time. We are at a point where we're so used to this, we kind of don't even notice it anymore. But if you're going into the field of journalism, you definitely have to have a sense of awareness. You have to be aware of what kind of, information you're putting out there. You have to be aware of how people are perceiving your information. I know this unit is relatively short, and again, there's a lot of links I'm going to drop into Blackboard for you. Not even specific things, but I just wanted to kind of direct your attention to a couple of different resources that are out there. I want to direct your attention to a couple of different YouTube channels that are out there that I think are really interesting. But the biggest thing with journalism, just like everything else, is it's a matter of practice.